At an elegant charity gala, Maria Williams, pregnant and dressed in a gold sequin gown, is thrust into a nightmare when her abusive ex-husband, Adrian Jones, strikes her in front of 200 indifferent guests. The room, filled with the clinking of crystal glasses and polite conversation, falls silent as Adrian humiliates her. While the crowd looks away, a calm figure, Chai Ha-jun, the Korean Mafia boss, observes. Without a word, he places his glass down, signaling that the tension in the room is about to erupt and the moment of retaliation is imminent.
Before I tell you what happened next to Maria, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This video will leave you astonished. Now, let's dive into it. The silence that followed the strike was more violent than the blow itself. In the grand ballroom of the Whitmore, where the air usually hummed with the curated murmurs of the elite, the sound of Adrian's hand connecting with Maria's cheek echoed like a gavel. Maria stumbled, her hand instinctively flying to cradle the swell of her stomach, her gold sequins shivering under the chandeliers. Adrian didn't look at her with regret. He looked at the room with a terrifying, practiced ownership. He adjusted his cufflink, his face twisted into a smirk that suggested he was waiting for the applause of a crowd too afraid to boo. He thought he knew this room. He thought wealth was a shield for cruelty. Then the glass hit the marble. It wasn't a smash, but a deliberate, heavy clack that cut through the tension. At the head of the primary table, Chai Ha-jun didn't stand up immediately. He simply let go of his scotch. He remained seated, his silhouette sharp against the cream-colored tapestries, but the energy in the room shifted toward him like a tide. Ha-jun's eyes were not filled with the frantic heat of a man about to fight. They were cold, clinical, and ancient. To him, Adrian Jones wasn't a threat. He was a glitch in a perfectly calibrated system. Slowly, with a grace that felt predatory, Ha-jun stood. He didn't look at the security guards rushing toward the perimeter, with the socialites clutching their pearls. He looked only at Adrian. As Ha-jun stepped forward, the crowd didn't just move, they evaporated, creating a corridor of polished floor between the two men. Adrian's smirk faltered. He was used to being the loudest man in a room of quiet ones, but he was now facing a man whose silence was louder than a scream. Ha-jun stopped exactly 3 feet away. He was taller, but it was his stillness that made Adrian look small. "In my house," Ha-jun said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried to every corner of the silent hall, "we do not break things that are precious, and we certainly do not touch what does not belong to us." Adrian tried to find his voice, his chest puffing out in a desperate display of bravado. "This is a private family matter, buddy. You don't know—" "I know the architecture of a coward," Ha-jun interrupted, his gaze dropping to Adrian's hand, then back to his eyes. He didn't raise his fists. He simply reached out and adjusted Adrian's crooked tie with a terrifyingly steady hand. The gesture was more demeaning than a punch. It was the act of a master correcting a servant. In that moment, the air left the room. Adrian's breathing became shallow, his pupils dilating as the primal realization hit him. He was no longer the apex predator.
He was a rabbit that had wandered into a wolf's den, and the wolf was deciding whether to kill him or simply watch him starve. Ha-jun turned his head slightly toward Maria, his expression softening by a fraction of a degree, a ghost of a protector appearing behind the mask of the boss. He didn't offer her a hand yet. He offered her the floor. He stepped aside, maintaining his icy vigil on Adrian, effectively turning the ballroom into a courtroom. The party was over. The trial had begun.
The elevator ride to the 14th floor was a vertical ascent into a different world. While the chaos of the ballroom faded into a muffled hum below, the air inside the private lift smelled of cedar and sterile, quiet efficiency. Maria stood in the corner, her fingers trembling against the silk of her gown, her breath coming in the jagged, shallow hitches of someone waiting for the second blow. Ha-Jun did not touch her. He stood at the opposite panel, his back a wall of black wool, giving her the one thing Adrian never had: space. When the doors slid open, they were met by a woman in a charcoal scrub suit, a medical bag already gripped in her hand. There was no fanfare, no frantic questioning. In Ha-Jun's world, preparation was the only currency that mattered. The suite was a sanctuary of soft linens and muted grays, illuminated by the amber glow of the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling glass. Ha-Jun gestured toward the oversized armchair. "Sit, Maria. Dr. Aris is here for the passenger, then for you." As the doctor began the quiet work of checking the baby's heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic gallop that filled the room with a fragile hope, Ha-Jun walked to the window. He didn't look at the medical exam. He looked at the street far below, where the flashing lights of Adrian's inevitable removal were just tiny sparks of red and blue. "I have a policy," Ha-Jun said, his voice cutting through the silence without breaking it. "It is zero tolerance. In the structures I build, there is no room for men who confuse their weakness with a woman's vulnerability." Maria looked up, her cheek beginning to bloom into a dark, painful purple. "He'll come back. He always finds the cracks." Ha-Jun turned then, his silhouette framed by the cold light of the moon. "There are no cracks here, Maria. Adrian Jones is a man who thinks he is a shark because he has only ever swum in a koi pond. He has just entered deep water. To a man like that, power is a loud noise. To me, power is the ability to make a person simply cease to exist in the world of the living, not through death, but through the systematic removal of every floor he stands on. His bank accounts, his reputation, his freedom, they are being erased as we speak." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy key card, laying it on the side table. "This floor is yours."
The doctors, the staff, the security, they report only to me, and I report only to the memory of those I couldn't protect. You are not a guest, and you are no longer a fugitive. You are an asset of the House of Chai, and we protect our own." Maria looked at the keycard, then at the doctor, who gave her a small, affirming nod. For the first time in 3 years, the phantom weight in her chest shifted. She didn't have to look for the exit plan anymore. Ha-Jun had built a fortress around her, and for the first time, the zero tolerance he spoke of didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise of peace. The moonlight through the 14th floor windows was a cold silver blade carving Ha-Jun's profile into sharp relief as he stood by the glass. Maria sat in the stillness, the rhythmic pulse of her unborn child's heart still echoing in her mind like a drum of war. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the things men like Ha-Jun usually took to their graves. He began to unbutton his charcoal vest coat, the fabric whispering against his silk shirt. Slowly, he rolled up his right sleeve, revealing a forearm corded with lean muscle and etched with the history of a violent life. But it was the ink near the crook of his elbow that caught the light, a small, faded star, identical to the one near his eye, but surrounded by a ring of jagged horizontal scars that looked like barbed wire. "There is a version of this story where I am just a man who likes order," Ha-Jun said, his voice dropping to a gravelly intimacy. "But the truth is far more expensive. This star, it was her name, Un-He." He didn't look at Maria as he spoke.
He looked through the glass, his eyes fixed on a past that clearly haunted the present. 10 years ago, I thought I was powerful because I had a fast car and a name people whispered in the alleys of Seoul. I was arrogant. I thought my shadow was long enough to cover her. I was wrong. He turned his arm slightly, the star catching the amber glow of a street lamp from below. A rival syndicate, men who traded in the same fear I did, took her to get to me. They didn't just kill her, Maria. They took their time. They dismantled her piece by piece over 3 days because they knew I was watching through a screen, powerless, locked behind a door I couldn't break. I listened to her voice until there was no voice left. I watched the light go out of the only thing that made me human. The air in the suite seemed to thicken. Maria watched him, seeing for the first time that his zero tolerance wasn't just a business policy, it was a penance. When I finally broke through that door, I didn't just kill them, he continued, his jaw tightening until the bone threatened to break the skin. I became the door. I decided that no one under my roof, no one in my orbit would ever have to wonder if a protector was coming. I'd built this empire not for the money, but for the walls, to ensure that the Adrian Joneses of the world are dealt with long before they reach the stairs.
He rolled his sleeve back down, hiding the star and the scars, the judge returning to replace the grieving man. You aren't just a woman I'm helping, Maria. You are the chance I never got, to see a mother and child reach the morning without a single bruise. That is the only thing I have left to buy. He turned back to the window, the black wool of his suit once again a seamless armor. Maria looked down at her own hands, realization dawning. She wasn't just being hidden, she was being guarded by a man who had turned his greatest failure into a fortress. The star on his face wasn't a mark of the Mafia, it was a permanent vow. The 4th floor of the Whitmore was not a ballroom, it was a war room. While Maria slept under the watchful eyes of the 14th floor security, the air in Ha-jun's private office was thick with the ozone of high-powered servers and the low, rhythmic tapping of keys. Ha-jun sat at the head of a mahogany table, his tuxedo jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up to reveal the star tattoo that served as his silent compass. Across from him sat 3 men known in the underworld as the accountants, men who didn't carry guns but whose fingers could trigger more destruction than a hollow-point bullet. Adrian Jones thinks his wealth is a fortress, Ha-jun said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. Show him it is a house of cards. The lead accountant, a man with spectacles that reflected the scrolling green light of a terminal, nodded. He's been sloppy, boss. Men who believe they are untouchable always leave a trail. They think the world is too afraid to look. The digital dismantling began with surgical precision. They didn't start with a hammer, they started with a scalpel. They bypassed the surface-level shell companies and dove into the paper trail of blood, a hidden ledger of offshore accounts used to funnel kickbacks from city construction contracts. Within the hour, the accountants had uncovered the architecture of a decade-long fraud. Adrian hadn't just been stealing from his partners, he had been skimming from the pension funds of the very workers who built his reputation. As the sun began to bleed a pale, bruised purple over the city skyline, the deeper rot emerged. Tucked away in encrypted folders were the hush money payments, documented transactions to 3 different law firms to bury previous assault allegations. Adrian's history was a repetitive loop of violence and bribery, a cycle he believed would never end because he had always been able to buy the silence of the room.
He didn't just hit her tonight, Hajun whispered, looking at a scanned police report from 5 years ago that never was filed. He's been practicing for years. We have enough to freeze his personal assets by the opening of the New York Stock Exchange. By noon, his credit lines will be severed. By 3, his board of directors will receive an anonymous packet containing the fraud evidence.
By dinner, he won't have enough money to buy a pack of cigarettes, let alone a lawyer. Hajun watched the data stream by, the systematic erasure of a man's existence. It was a bloodless execution, but the impact would be total. He wasn't just taking Adrian's money, he was taking his air. He was removing the size Adrian used to intimidate the vulnerable. "Proceed," Hajun commanded. With a single keystroke, the accountants sent the first wave of digital termites into Adrian's empire. The foundation didn't just crack, it began to dissolve. Hajun stood and walked to the window, watching the city wake up. Adrian Jones would wake up as a titan, but by the time the sun set, he would be a ghost, hunted by the very laws he thought he had outrun. The paper trail had finally led to a dead end. The 14th floor became a world governed not by the ticking of a clock, but by the steady internal rhythm of recovery. For the first few weeks, Maria still moved like a ghost, her back hugging the walls and her eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors every time the elevator chimed. It was the shallow breathing of a survivor, the kind that only takes in enough air to stay alert for the next disaster. But Hajun's sanctuary was designed to break that cycle. He never crowded her. Instead, he provided the quiet tools of a new life. A library of books on architecture and public health, a balcony where the city noise was a distant hum, and the constant, silent presence of security that acted as a shield rather than a cage. Slowly, the hypervigilance began to dissolve. Maria stopped looking for the exits and started looking at the horizon. She began to walk with a different weight. It wasn't just the physical burden of the pregnancy, it was the gravity of a woman who was finally being anchored by safety. Under the guidance of Dr. Aris, Maria's health flourished. The dark purple bruise on her cheek faded into a memory, replaced by a glow that had nothing to do with the gala's chandeliers and everything to do with her own burgeoning strength. She spent her afternoons sketching plans for a community center, her pen moving with a confidence she hadn't felt since before she met Adrian. She was no longer a product of his control. She was becoming the architect of her own future. The transformation reached its peak on a rainy Tuesday in late autumn. The storm outside lashed against the glass of the suite, but inside, the atmosphere was focused and calm. When the first contractions began, Maria didn't panic. She didn't feel the old urge to hide or apologize for her pain. She gripped the arms of the chair and breathed, deep, belly-filling breaths that claimed the air as her own. Hajun remained in the outer room, a silent sentinel shadowed by the star-shaped vow on his face. He didn't intrude on the sanctity of the moment, but Maria could feel the strength of his presence through the wall, a foundation that wouldn't crack.
As the sun began to peek through the gray clouds, the suite was filled with a new sound, a sharp, defiant cry that cut through the lingering ghosts of the past. Dr. Aris placed a warm, heavy bundle against Maria's chest. A baby girl with a tuft of dark hair and a grip that was already fierce. In that moment, the last of the shallow breaths vanished. Maria looked down at her daughter, and the pulse she felt wasn't the frantic heartbeat of a victim. It was the steady, iron-willed thrum of a mother. She realized then that Hajun hadn't just given her a room, he had given her the time to find her own spine. She whispered a name, Yunhui, in honor of the woman who couldn't be saved, and felt the circle of violence finally break. She was no longer running, she was home. The winter air outside the Whitmore was sharp enough to cut, but inside the war room on the 4th floor, the heat was digital. Hajun sat before a triptych of monitors, the star-shaped tattoo near his eye catching the flickering blue light of a security feed. He wasn't looking for a breach, he was designing one. "The problem with men like Adrian," Hajun said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "is that they confuse a lack of noise with a lack of presence. He thinks because the accountant stopped calling, the world has forgotten him. He thinks he's found the blind spot." On the center screen, a highlighted map of the Whitmore service entrance flickered. For 3 nights, a glitch in the encrypted perimeter had been left pulsing like a heartbeat, just long enough for a desperate man with a dwindling bank account and a high-priced private investigator to notice. It was a classic honeypot trap, a manufactured weakness designed to appeal to Adrian's specific brand of arrogance. He wouldn't see it as a lure. He would see it as his rightful path back to the property he believed was stolen from him. "He's moved to a motel in Queens," the lead accountant reported, tapping a key to bring up a grainy photo of a black SUV. "He sold his watch. He sold his remaining shares at a loss. He's reaching the nothing left to lose stage. Our sensors picked up his phone pinging the Whitmore secondary server 6 times in the last hour." Hajun nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, one that never reached his cold, predatory eyes. "Good. A cornered rat doesn't look for traps. He looks for holes. We will give him exactly one." Hajun stood and walked to the window, looking up toward the 14th floor where Maria was currently singing a soft, wordless melody to their daughter. The contrast between the peace he was guarding and the violence he was orchestrating was a thin glass line. He knew that for Maria to truly breathe, the ghost of Adrian Jones had to be exorcised, not just ignored. He needed Adrian to commit an act so undeniable, so public in its intent, that no lawyer or bribe could ever erase it.
"Lower the firewall on the freight elevator at 0200 hours, Hajun commanded, his tone shifting to the clinical finality of a judge. "Ensure the hallway cameras are looping on a 30-second delay. I want him to feel the thrill of the hunt. I want him to believe he is the shadow in the dark." He reached into his desk and pulled out a small, weighted leather pouch, the gold rings he had removed at the gala weeks ago. He slid them back onto his fingers one by one. The preparation was over. The stage was set. The bait was the perceived silence of the House of Chai, and the trap was a man who had spent 10 years learning exactly how to punish those who broke his sanctuary. "Let him come," Hajun whispered to the glass. "Let him think he's winning until the very moment the steel shuts behind him." The 2 a.m. silence of the Whitmore was artificial, a vacuum created by the absence of the city's daytime roar. Inside the 14th floor suite, the only sound was the rhythmic soft huff of the baby's breathing in the bassinet. Maria sat in the armchair, not in the shadows, but bathed in the pale glow of a single floor lamp. She was not dressed in a nightgown. She wore the same deep charcoal sweater she had chosen that afternoon, her hair pulled back, her spine a straight, unwavering line. In the hallway, the faint metallic scuff of the freight elevator doors echoed. To anyone else, it would have been a ghost of a sound. To Maria, it was the specific frequency of her past coming to collect its debt. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the phone or crawl under the bed. Instead, she rested her hand on the arm of the chair, feeling the cool weight of the security alert button tucked into the upholstery, a tool she had no intention of using until the moment was exactly right. The heavy oak door groaned, the lock yielding to the digital bypass Adrian believed he had outsmarted. He stepped into the room, a jagged silhouette of desperation.
He looked different. His expensive tuxedo was gone, replaced by a stained leather jacket, his face gaunt and twitching with the erratic energy of a man who had lost his empire and blamed the only person he could still hope to hurt. "You think you're safe here?" Adrian's voice was a wet rasp, trembling with a volatile mix of rage and entitlement. He didn't see the cameras. He didn't see the silent black-clad figures standing just beyond the threshold of the darkened kitchen. He only saw Maria. "You think some suit with a tattoo can own what belongs to me?" He lunged forward, his hand raised to reclaim his dominance with the same familiar violence. But Maria didn't cower. She didn't close her eyes. She stood up, moving with a grounded, maternal grace that halted him more effectively than a blow.
"I don't belong to the House of Chai, Adrian," she said, her voice so steady it seemed to lower the temperature of the room. "And I certainly don't belong to you. I am the mother of a daughter who will never know the sound of your voice. That is the only fact that exists in this room." Adrian hesitated, the air leaving his lungs. He was looking for the shallow breathing, the flinch, the apology. Finding none, his face contorted. "I'll take her. I'll take everything." "You have nothing left to take," Adrian replied, stepping into the light so he could see the total lack of fear in her eyes. "Hajun didn't take your money, Adrian. Your own greed did. He just turned on the lights so everyone could see you stealing." She saw his eyes dart toward the bassinet, the old predatory instinct flaring one last time. In that second, Maria's hand closed over the heavy glass carafe on the side table. She didn't wait for him to move. She stepped between him and the child, her posture that of a guardian who had already processed the cost of the fight. "The choice in the dark is mine now," she whispered. At that signal, the floor lamp flickered twice. The shadows in the corner of the room detached themselves, and the clinical, heavy silence of the House of Chai descended. Adrian turned, realizing too late that the door hadn't been left open by luck, but by design. Maria sat back down, her eyes never leaving his as the security team closed the distance, her breathing remaining as deep and steady as the sea. For the first time, she wasn't watching the exit. She was watching the end. The descent from the 14th floor was not a retreat. It was a procession. As the elevator doors opened into the Whitmore's lobby, the artificial silence of the upper suites was replaced by the harsh, rhythmic strobing of blue and red lights reflecting off the marble floors. Hajun led the way, his hand resting lightly on the small of Maria's back, not to direct her, but to anchor her to the moment of her own triumph. In her arms, the baby remained asleep, a living testament to a peace that had been bought with iron. Adrian was already in the center of the lobby, but he was no longer the man who had walked into the gala weeks ago. He was pinned against a fluted Roman column by two uniformed officers, his hands cinched in steel, his leather jacket torn. The lobby, once a stage for his vanity, had become the site of his public dismantling. A crowd of late-night guests and hotel staff had gathered at the periphery, their phones raised like digital torches, recording the final collapse of the House of Jones. "You can't do this!" Adrian's voice cracked, a desperate thin sound that carried no weight. "I have assets. I have—" "You have nothing, Adrian," Hajun interrupted, his voice cutting through the lobby with the cold finality of a guillotine.
He stepped forward until he was inches from Adrian's face, the star-shaped tattoo near his eye dark and steady. The assets you speak of were frozen at 0900. The board of directors signed your removal at noon. Even the shoes you were wearing were purchased with credit lines that no longer exist. You are standing in a building you cannot afford, defending a reputation that has been dissolved into a paper trail of fraud. Ajun reached out and plucked the expensive silk tie from around Adrian's neck, the same tie he had straightened weeks ago. He dropped it onto the floor. It was the ultimate stripping of pride, a visual declaration that the armor of the elite had been revoked. Maria stepped forward then, moving out from Ajun's shadow. She didn't scream and she didn't strike him. She simply looked at the man who had spent years convincing her she was small. "Look at her, Adrian," she said, nodding toward the child in her arms. "Look at the last thing you will ever lose. You didn't just fail as a husband, you failed as a man. And from this moment on, you are a ghost in our story." The lead officer stepped forward, his expression an iron mask. "Adrian Jones, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, racketeering, and felony assault." As they hauled him toward the spinning glass doors, Adrian's bravado finally shattered. He began to weep, not with remorse, but with the hollow, ugly terror of a man who realized that the size he used to intimidate the world was gone. He was led out into the winter night, the flashes of a dozen cameras capturing his face for the morning headlines. The House of Jones hadn't just fallen, it had been erased. Ajun turned back to Maria, the rings on his fingers catching the fading light of the sirens. The lobby was quiet again, the spectators beginning to disperse. The air felt lighter, the oxygen finally returning to a space that had been choked by fear for too long. He gestured toward the waiting car outside. The war was over, and the reconstruction was about to begin. The morning sun in the new estate didn't just illuminate the room, it felt like a beginning. The house, a sprawling sanctuary of glass and reclaimed stone, situated far from the reach of the city's shadows, belonged fully to Maria. There were no hidden cameras here, no glitches in the security, only the steady, peaceful quiet of a life she had finally claimed as her own. Maria stood by the north-facing window, her daughter, Yoon-hae, cradled against her shoulder, watching the light stretch across the blueprints laid out on the mahogany table. She was no longer sketching dreams of escape. She was drafting the foundations of a community center for women like her who had forgotten how to breathe. Behind her, the floorboards groaned with a familiar, heavy cadence. Ajun stood in the doorway, his charcoal overcoat draped over his arm and a single leather suitcase at his feet. The car was waiting to take him to the airport, back to the complicated steel and neon of Seoul, to settle the final accounts of his empire. The air between them was thick with the weight of the last few months, a bond forged not in the adrenaline of the gala, but in the quiet hours of recovery.
"The building faces north," Ha-jun said, his voice a low, resonant anchor in the bright room. "The light will stay steady all through the winter. It is a good place for a creator." Maria turned, her gaze meeting the star-shaped mark near his eye. For the first time, she didn't see a badge of the underworld. She saw a man who had finally found a way to honor his ghosts. "You're leaving today?" "I am," he replied, stepping closer, though he maintained the respectful distance he had never once broken. He looked at the child, whose small hand reached out toward the gold ring on his finger. "But the House of Chai does not leave its heart behind. My lawyers have finalized the documents in Seoul. When I return, I want to do more than protect her from the shadows, Maria." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet-lined box, but inside was not a jewel. It was a silver locket engraved with the same star, containing a digital chip, a legacy. "I want to give her my name, not as a mark of the syndicate, but as a daughter of the house.
I want to adopt her. I want to be the father who ensures she never has to learn the architecture of a coward. Maria felt the final piece of the old world dissolve. This wasn't a transaction or a claim of ownership. It was a vow of kinship. She looked from the man who had become her North Star to the daughter who was her son. "She would be honored to have your name, Ha-Jun," Maria whispered, "and I would be honored to have you back." Ha-Jun nodded once, a gesture of solemn finality. He touched the baby's forehead with a tenderness that contradicted his reputation, then turned toward the door. As the car pulled away, Maria didn't feel the old panic of being left behind. She stood in her home, the architect of her own future, looking out at the horizon. The most radical thing a survivor can do is build something new where the old thing burned. As she picked up her pen to finalize the day's plans, she knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving the winter, she was welcoming the light.